"You're no longer part of this family," my mother-in-law said as she pulled my name off the family chart hanging in the center of the room. Everyone watched. No one objected. No one even looked surprised. I simply smiled. What none of them knew was that within a few hours, everything they thought they owned would be out of their reach. My name is Claire Whitmore. I'm 68 years old, and until that afternoon I believed loyalty still meant something. The annual Whitmore family meeting had always been treated like a sacred tradition. Every summer, relatives flew in from across the country to gather at the family estate outside Hartford, Connecticut. The house itself sat on nearly 20 acres of land, with perfectly trimmed hedges, white columns, and enough history to make every visitor feel small. My mother-in-law, Margaret Whitmore, loved reminding everyone that the property had belonged to her family for generations. She treated the estate less like a home and more like a monument to her authority. That Saturday morning I drove there alone. My husband Daniel had already arrived earlier to help prepare for the gathering. As I pulled into the circular driveway, luxury vehicles lined both sides. Black SUVs, imported sedans, expensive pickup trucks polished until they reflected the sunlight. The family had done well over the years, or at least they liked to believe they had. I adjusted the sleeve of my navy blue blazer and stepped out of my car. The July air was warm, already pushing past 80 degrees. The scent of freshly cut grass drifted across the property. Everything looked exactly as it always had, perfect on the surface. I walked through the front doors and immediately noticed something different. Conversations stopped when I entered. Not completely, just enough for me to notice. Several relatives glanced at one another before forcing polite smiles. Karen, my sister-in-law, barely acknowledged me. Her son Ethan looked down at his phone. Even Daniel seemed distracted, avoiding eye contact before quickly turning back to a conversation with his cousin. A strange feeling settled in my stomach. For months, small things had felt off. Missed calls, family dinners I learned about afterward, decisions being made without including me. I had convinced myself I was imagining it. Families go through phases. People get busy. Life becomes complicated. At least that's what I kept telling myself. Around noon, Margaret called everyone into the main gathering room. The room had always been her stage. Portraits of long-dead relatives covered the walls. Antique furniture sat untouched. Every chair seemed positioned to reinforce a hierarchy she had spent decades building. I took my usual seat near Daniel. Margaret remained standing. She wore a cream-colored suit and the expression of someone preparing to deliver a verdict. Then she walked toward the large framed family chart displayed beside the fireplace. My eyes followed her hand. At first, I didn't understand what she was doing. Then she reached for the small nameplate beneath my photograph. The room became completely silent. Margaret removed it slowly, deliberately, as if she wanted everyone to appreciate the moment. She held the plate in her hand and looked directly at me. The smile on her face never reached her eyes. And in that instant I realized this meeting had never been about family at all. It was about me. Margaret let the silence linger long enough for everyone to absorb what she had done. The small metal nameplate rested in her hand as though it were evidence in a trial that had already been decided. I remained seated. My hands rested calmly in my lap. Around me, relatives shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, but none of them spoke. Not one person questioned why my place in the family was suddenly being erased after more than 3 decades of marriage. Margaret cleared her throat and turned toward the group. "Certain adjustments need to be made," she said. "Family leadership requires clarity." Her voice carried the confidence of someone who had never been challenged. Several people nodded immediately. Others simply avoided looking at me. Daniel stared at the polished hardwood floor. I waited for him to say something. Anything. A simple objection would have been enough. Instead, he remained silent. The disappointment settled deeper than I expected. It was not anger. Anger burns hot. This felt cold. The kind of realization that arrives quietly and stays forever. Margaret continued speaking about the future of the family estate, upcoming investments, property management, and inheritance planning. My name never came up again. It was as if removing the plate had removed me entirely. I listened carefully. Over the years, I had learned that people often reveal the most when they assume you no longer matter. Karen began discussing a vacation property in Colorado. Ethan talked about expanding a business venture that had struggled for years. Another cousin mentioned refinancing debt, connected to a commercial development outside Boston. The numbers being discussed were significant. Millions of dollars moving from one project to another. Yet something caught my attention. Nearly every plan depended on access to funding that none of them personally controlled. The realization sat quietly in the back of my mind. Margaret eventually placed the nameplate into a leather folder beside her chair. The gesture felt symbolic, final, deliberate. Then she looked directly at me. "Claire, perhaps it would be best if you stepped out while the family discusses internal matters." A few people lowered their eyes. Others pretended to review documents in front of them. Daniel finally looked up. For a brief moment our eyes met. I saw hesitation there. Uncertainty. Maybe even regret. But regret without action changes nothing. I stood slowly and straightened my blazer. The room remained silent. No one offered support. No one asked me to stay. I picked up my handbag and thanked Margaret for her hospitality. The words surprised several people. They had expected resistance. An argument. Tears. Instead I smiled politely. Margaret looked almost disappointed by my composure. As I walked toward the door, I noticed the large family chart hanging beside the fireplace. My photograph was still there, but the space beneath it was empty now. A blank space where my name used to be. Strange how quickly people try to rewrite history when they think power belongs entirely to them. Outside, the afternoon sun felt warmer than before. A light breeze moved through the trees surrounding the estate. I walked across the stone driveway toward my car without looking back. Halfway there, my phone vibrated inside my handbag. I glanced at the screen and saw a message that had arrived only seconds earlier. The sender was someone from a world the Whitmore family knew nothing about. I read the message once. Then I smiled. For the first time that day, I understood exactly why Margaret had made her move. Unfortunately for her, she had chosen the worst possible moment to underestimate me. I sat in my car for several minutes without starting the engine. The message remained open on my phone screen. Most people would have recognized the sender immediately. The name appeared regularly in financial publications and business news interviews. To me, it was simply Michael, the chief executive officer who had worked beside me for nearly 20 years. His message was short. The board meeting had ended successfully. The acquisition had been approved unanimously. Congratulations. The timing almost made me laugh. Inside the estate, the Whitmore family was deciding whether I deserved a place at their table. Across the country, executives had just approved a transaction worth hundreds of millions of dollars under a company I quietly owned. I locked my phone and placed it beside me. Then I started the car and drove away. The roads outside Hartford were lined with tall trees and historic stone walls. Everything looked peaceful, normal. Yet my thoughts kept returning to the room I had just left. Not because of the humiliation. That part no longer surprised me. What unsettled me was how confidently they had acted. People only behave that way when they believe they understand the entire picture. Margaret thought she understood mine. So did Karen. So did Ethan. Even Daniel only knew fragments of the truth. Years ago, I had learned an important lesson. Wealth attracts attention. Attention attracts opinions. Opinions attract expectations. The moment people discover what you have, they begin calculating what portion belongs to them. That was why I had spent decades protecting my privacy. Most of the Whitmore family believed I had worked as a consultant before retiring. Technically, that was true. They simply never asked what kind of consulting business eventually became an investment firm, and what kind of investment firm eventually became a holding company with interests across multiple industries. The fewer questions people asked, the easier it became to remain invisible. By the time I reached my home overlooking Long Island Sound, the afternoon sun had begun drifting westward. The house was quiet. I preferred it that way. No grand gates. No excessive displays of wealth. Just a comfortable waterfront property with large windows and enough space for reflection. I set my keys on the kitchen counter and poured a glass of iced tea. Then I opened the folder that had arrived earlier that week. Inside were financial summaries, trust structures, partnership agreements, and family investment records. I slowly reviewed each page. Certain names appeared repeatedly. Margaret, Karen, Ethan, several cousins, various trusts, various distributions, various financial arrangements. Most of them had one thing in common. They were connected, directly or indirectly, to entities under my control. Not because I wanted power over them. Years ago, Daniel had asked me to help family members who needed guidance. I had agreed. Quietly, discreetly, generously. Apparently generosity had been mistaken for weakness. I looked out across the water as evening settled over the shoreline. The waves moved calmly beneath the fading sunlight. My phone vibrated again. This time it was Daniel calling. I watched his name appear on the screen. Ring after ring echoed through the room. Eventually the call stopped. Seconds later another message arrived. Claire, we need to talk. Something important is happening. I stared at the words for a moment before placing the phone face down on the table. The truth was, something important had already happened. They simply did not know it yet. That evening, I did not return Daniel's call. Instead, I sat on the back patio and watched the last traces of sunlight disappear beyond the water. The silence gave me room to think, and once I started looking backward, certain memories became impossible to ignore. For years, I had dismissed small slights as personality differences. Margaret had always been controlling. Karen had always been entitled. Ethan had grown up believing success arrived because of his last name rather than his efforts. I convinced myself that families survived by overlooking imperfections. Looking back now, I realized how often I had been the one making those compromises. I remembered the first holiday dinner after Daniel and I married. Margaret had introduced every family member around the table except me. When someone asked what I did for work, she answered on my behalf before I could speak. Claire keeps busy with little projects, she had said. At the time I smiled and let it go. What nobody knew was that I had just completed a transaction that generated more revenue than several Whitmore businesses combined. Then there was Karen's failed boutique venture. 15 years earlier, she had come to us desperate for help. Banks had declined her applications. Investors had walked away. Daniel asked if I could review the proposal. I spent weeks restructuring the financial plan and quietly arranged funding through one of my firms. Karen never knew where the money originated. Years later, she proudly told everyone she had built the business entirely on her own. I never corrected her. Ethan was no different. Fresh out of college, he launched a technology startup with more confidence than experience. When the company nearly collapsed during its second year, a private investment group stepped in and provided the capital necessary to survive. Ethan often bragged about attracting sophisticated investors. He never realized I owned a controlling interest in the group that saved his company. The pattern repeated itself over and over. Family members needed assistance. I helped. Family members succeeded. They took credit. Family members prospered. They forgot. The strange part was that I never expected gratitude. I simply expected respect. Yet respect seemed to be the one thing they were unwilling to offer. Around 9 o'clock, another message arrived from Daniel. This one was longer. He said Margaret may have handled the meeting poorly. He said emotions were running high. He said misunderstandings could be fixed. I read the message twice before setting the phone aside. The word misunderstanding stood out. There had been no misunderstanding. Margaret removed my name while looking directly into my eyes. Karen remained silent. Ethan remained silent. Daniel remained silent. Those were choices, not misunderstandings. I walked into my study and opened a secure cabinet built into the wall. Inside were files documenting decades of investments, partnerships, trusts, and ownership structures. The Whitmore family saw themselves as independent. The paperwork told a very different story. One by one, I placed several folders on my desk. Then I picked up the phone and called Michael. He answered immediately. "Good evening, Claire," he said. "I assume you have reviewed the reports." I looked down at the names printed across the documents and allowed myself a small smile. "Yes," I replied calmly, "and I think it is finally time for a few important adjustments." Michael listened quietly as I explained what had happened at the estate. He had worked with me long enough to recognize the difference between frustration and finality. When I finished speaking, several seconds passed before he responded. "Are you certain?" he asked. "Once we begin, There is no practical way to reverse everything quickly. I leaned back in my chair and looked at the files spread across my desk. The answer came easily. I am certain. The next morning began earlier than usual. By 6 o'clock, sunlight was already reflecting off the water outside my windows. I carried a cup of coffee into my study and reviewed every document one final time. Despite what the Whitmore family believed, nothing connected to them would disappear overnight. That was not how responsible financial management worked. However, there were protections, reviews, and approvals that could be activated immediately. Structures designed to prevent misuse. Structures that existed specifically because large amounts of money required accountability. For years, I had approved exceptions. I had extended deadlines. I had authorized flexibility. I had trusted people based on relationships rather than performance. That generosity ended the moment Margaret removed my name from the family chart. At 8 o'clock, I joined a secure video conference with Michael and several senior executives. No one wasted time with small talk. The meeting lasted less than 40 minutes. During that conversation, dormant compliance reviews were activated. Special approvals were suspended pending evaluation. Several trust distributions were temporarily paused. Outstanding loan renewals were moved into reassessment status. Every action followed existing policy. Every decision complied with established procedures. The only difference was that I stopped making exceptions. After the call ended, I felt surprisingly calm. There was no satisfaction in what I had done. Only clarity. Around noon, my phone began lighting up with notifications. The first came from Ethan. His message was brief. He asked whether I knew why his latest funding request had suddenly entered review status. 10 minutes later, Karen called twice. Then she sent a message asking if I had heard anything about delays affecting several accounts. I did not respond. By late afternoon, the pattern intensified. Emails arrived. Voicemails accumulated. Questions multiplied. Apparently, people become very interested in financial details when those details affect them personally. As evening approached, Daniel finally appeared at my front door. Through the large living room windows, I watched him standing on the porch. He looked older than he had only days earlier. Less confident. Less certain. I opened the door and invited him inside. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Daniel glanced around the room before settling into a chair across from me. "Something is happening," he said quietly. "Everyone is panicking." I nodded but said nothing. Daniel rubbed his hands together and stared at the floor. "Margaret thinks it is some kind of coincidence. Karen thinks the banks are making mistakes. Ethan believes there must be a technical issue." He finally looked up at me. The expression in his eyes had changed. For the first time in years, I saw genuine curiosity instead of assumptions. "Claire," he said carefully, "what is it that nobody in this family knows about you?" Daniel's question hung in the air between us. For a moment, neither of us moved. The grandfather clock in the corner continued its steady rhythm while evening shadows stretched across the room. I studied the man sitting across from me. We had been married for 34 years. Long enough to share dreams, disappointments, victories, and losses. Yet somehow he was looking at me as though he had never truly known me. "That depends," I said quietly. "How much do you actually want to know?" Daniel leaned back in his chair. "Everything." I almost smiled. It was a simple answer, but life rarely worked that way. Most people only want the truth when it confirms what they already believe. The truth I was about to reveal would do the opposite. I stood and walked toward the study. Daniel followed silently. Once inside, I opened the cabinet built into the wall and removed several folders. Then I placed them on the desk between us. Annual reports, ownership structures, corporate filings, partnership agreements. Decades of work reduced to paper and signatures. Daniel stared at the documents without touching them. "What is all this?" he asked. "My career," I replied. "The part nobody ever cared enough to ask about." Slowly, he opened the first folder. His eyes moved across the pages. First he looked confused, then surprised, then completely speechless. I watched the realization unfold piece by piece. The company names, the ownership percentages, the financial statements, the numbers, especially the numbers. Several minutes passed before he finally looked up. "Claire." His voice sounded different now. Smaller somehow. You own all of this. I nodded. Not all of it. But enough. Daniel looked back at the documents. This cannot be right. It is. He opened another file. Then another. The silence grew heavier with every page. Eventually he set the final folder down and rubbed his forehead. Margaret has no idea. No. Karen does not know. No. Ethan certainly does not know. No. Daniel stared at me. And all these years. I finished the sentence for him. All these years I allowed them to believe whatever made them comfortable. Outside, a boat moved slowly across the dark water. Its lights reflected against the surface of the Sound. The calm scene contrasted sharply with what was happening inside the Whitmore family. My phone vibrated on the desk. Then again. And again. Notifications appeared one after another. Karen. Ethan. 2 cousins. Even Margaret. The messages were becoming less confident now. Less demanding. More concerned. Daniel noticed the screen lighting up repeatedly. They are trying to reach you. I know. What are you going to do? I looked at the growing list of missed calls. For years they ignored my voice because they believed I had no influence. Now they wanted answers because they were finally feeling uncertainty themselves. I locked the phone and slid it aside. Nothing tonight, I said calmly. Tonight they can spend some time wondering what happens when the person they dismiss stops protecting them. The following morning, the consequences of uncertainty began spreading through the Whitmore family faster than any rumor ever could. I woke before sunrise and walked along the shoreline behind my house. The air was cool, and the water was calm enough to reflect the pale colors of the sky. For the first time in days, I felt completely at peace. My phone remained silent during the walk because I had turned it off the night before. When I returned home and switched it back on, dozens of notifications appeared almost instantly. The confidence I had seen at the family meeting was gone. In its place were questions. Karen had sent 7 messages. Ethan had left 4 voicemails. 2 cousins wanted emergency meetings. Even relatives who rarely contacted me suddenly seemed eager to reconnect. I poured myself a cup of coffee and listened to the first voicemail. Ethan sounded frustrated. He explained that a major expansion project had stalled unexpectedly. Investors were requesting additional reviews. Funding approvals had been delayed. He insisted there had to be some mistake. The second voicemail came from Karen. Her voice carried a nervous edge I had never heard before. She said several planned transactions had been postponed. Advisors were asking unusual questions. Documents that normally move through the system in days were suddenly being examined much more carefully. Neither of them understood what was happening. Neither of them realized they were finally being treated exactly like everyone else. No special treatment. No invisible safety net. No quiet intervention from me. Around 10 o'clock, Michael called with an update. Everything was proceeding as expected. Internal reviews had uncovered several projects requiring additional documentation. Compliance teams were doing their jobs. Risk departments were doing theirs. Nothing dramatic. Nothing unfair. Just accountability. When the call ended, I opened my email. Among the growing collection of messages, one stood out immediately. It came from Margaret. The subject line contained only 3 words. We need answers. I opened it slowly. The message itself was surprisingly short. Margaret demanded an explanation for the disruptions affecting the family. She claimed people were suffering unnecessary stress. She insisted someone was interfering with matters that should remain private. Reading her words, I could not help noticing the irony. Only days earlier, she had publicly declared that I was no longer part of family matters. Now family matters suddenly required my attention. I closed the email without responding. Shortly after noon, Daniel called again. This time I answered. He sounded exhausted. There is another meeting scheduled for tomorrow, he said. Margaret wants everyone there. I looked out the window toward the water. Everyone? I asked. A brief silence followed. Yes, Daniel replied carefully. Including you. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was predictable. The same people who had erased my name were now trying to put it back. The difference was that the decision no longer belonged to them. I thanked Daniel for the information and ended the call. Then I walked into my study and looked at the empty chair beside my desk. Tomorrow, the Whitmore family would gather again. This time they would arrive with questions. And for the first time in a very long time, I would decide which answers they deserved. The next afternoon I drove back to the Whitmore estate under a gray sky that threatened rain. The long driveway looked exactly as it had a week earlier, but the atmosphere felt entirely different. Luxury vehicles still filled the parking area. Yet the confidence that usually accompanied those arrivals had vanished. As I stepped through the front doors, conversations immediately stopped. This time nobody looked through me. Nobody acted as though I did not belong there. In fact, several relatives stood up the moment they saw me. Karen approached first. The same woman who had remained silent during my humiliation now wore an expression that resembled concern. She asked how I had been. She asked whether we could talk privately. I smiled politely and continued walking. A few feet farther, Ethan intercepted me. He attempted to explain that recent business difficulties were creating enormous pressure. He said he hoped there had been some misunderstanding. The word appeared again. Misunderstanding. It seemed to be everyone's favorite explanation when consequences arrived. I entered the main gathering room and immediately noticed the family chart hanging beside the fireplace. My photograph remained exactly where it had always been. More importantly, my nameplate had returned beneath it. Someone had carefully polished the metal surface. The gesture would have been amusing if it had not been so transparent. Margaret stood near the front of the room surrounded by relatives who suddenly seemed much less certain of her leadership. She greeted me with a strained smile. For years she had commanded every gathering with complete authority. Today she looked tired. Older. The room gradually filled as everyone took their seats. No one wanted to begin. No one seemed eager to speak first. Eventually Margaret cleared her throat. She thanked everyone for attending. She mentioned recent complications affecting several family projects. She spoke about unity, cooperation, communication. Listening to her felt like listening to someone describe values she had never practiced. Finally, she turned toward me. "Claire," she said carefully, "perhaps there have been mistakes on all sides." Several heads nodded. Immediately, others avoided eye contact. I remained silent. Margaret continued. She said emotions had run high during the previous meeting. She suggested people may have acted too quickly. She explained that family relationships should always take priority over temporary disagreements. Temporary disagreements. An interesting description for publicly removing someone from the family. When she finished speaking, the room became completely still. Every face turned toward me. They expected reassurance. They expected forgiveness. They expected me to restore the invisible support system they had spent years taking for granted. Instead, I looked around the room slowly. Karen. At Ethan. At the cousins who suddenly remembered my phone number. At Daniel. Finally, I looked at Margaret. "Before we discuss the future," I said calmly, "I think it is time everyone understands the past." The silence that followed felt heavier than anything I had experienced inside that room before. For the first time, nobody interrupted. Nobody argued. Nobody dismissed my words. They simply listened. And that was exactly where I wanted them. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The room that had once felt so eager to judge me now seemed afraid of what I might say next. I stood slowly and walked toward the family chart beside the fireplace. My fingers brushed the edge of the frame before I turned back to face them. "For years," I said calmly, "many of you believed I was simply fortunate. You assumed I lived comfortably because of Daniel. You assumed my work was insignificant. You assumed I sat quietly because I had nothing worth saying." No one interrupted. Karen lowered her eyes. Ethan stared at the table. Margaret remained perfectly still. I continued. "What you never understood is that while you were busy measuring status through family names and appearances, I was building something of my own." I placed several folders on the table. The sound echoed through the room. One by one, they opened the documents. I watched the same realization spread across their faces that I had already seen in Daniel's study days earlier. Confusion became surprise. Surprise became disbelief. Then disbelief gave way to silence. Real silence. The kind that arrives when facts leave no room for argument. Ethan flipped through pages repeatedly as if the numbers might change. Karen read every line twice. Even Margaret's composure began to crack. These entities, I explained, provided funding, guarantees, trust administration, and investment oversight for many of the projects discussed in this room for years. Nobody needed further explanation. They understood. The safety net they depended on had never been anonymous. It had never belonged to some distant institution. It had belonged to me. Margaret finally spoke. Her voice sounded weaker than I had ever heard. Why did you never tell us? I looked at her for several seconds before answering. Because respect given only after learning someone's net worth is not respect. It is calculation. The room fell silent again. This time nobody looked away. They could not. The truth was sitting directly in front of them. Daniel stood and moved beside me. Not to defend me. Not to speak for me. Simply to stand there. It was the first genuine gesture I had seen from him in a long time. Margaret slowly removed my nameplate from the chart and held it out toward me. The same nameplate she had removed days earlier. I accepted it politely. Then I placed it on the table instead of returning it to the wall. Several people looked confused. I smiled. I do not need a place on a chart to know who I am. No one had an answer for that. Outside, rain began tapping softly against the windows. The meeting eventually ended, but not with arguments or dramatic speeches. People simply gathered their papers and left. One by one. Quietly. Thoughtfully. When I finally walked out of the estate, the air smelled fresh from the rain. Behind me stood a family that had spent years mistaking kindness for weakness and silence for insignificance. Ahead of me stretched an open road and a future that no longer depended on anyone's approval. Some people spend their lives chasing power. I learned something far more valuable. The moment you stop needing recognition from those who never appreciated you, you become truly free.